philosophy public lecture. I'm always delighted to see that so many of you are here on this lovely evening after strong Emma. Isn't it nice to see the sun again? So here we have Keti Chukhrov, who joined us in September 2017 from Moscow. She was the associate professor in the Department of Cultural Theory at National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow for 5 years, and also the head of the theory department at National Center for Contemporary Art, Moscow. She has written several articles and several book-length works. Out of them, the one that stands out is To Perform, Theater in Philosophical Criticism of Art, and also, which was really a surprise to me after I met Keti, I didn't know about it, that she's also written a volume of dramatic writings, Just Humans. She's also the author of a few video plays which have shown around the world, including in New York. And she's currently finishing a book on the interpretation of the notion of the ideal in Soviet Marxist philosophy of 1960s and 1970s. So I gather we're going to hear something of that, which is going to go in the new book. And you are the privileged audience who will hear about it first before it goes out to the world. So welcome to Keti.
Thank you. Thank you, Mina. I'm really inspired to be here and to be within the series of lectures of Royal Philosophy Institute Society. Mina, before scheduling this lecture, asked me to be as accessible and as easy as possible. I will be trying to do that, although with all those issues of epistemology and comparisons, it's not so easy, but I will try my best. If I'm a little bit doing things complicated, please stop me and ask to explain or just interfere, and we shall proceed together. First of all, this legacy, Marxist philosophy of 60s, 70s, is to a certain extent in shadow and became quite secondary and became certain issue of archaeological research simply because there are so many more advanced and more well-known theories of emancipation which we know from the bulk of European theory of emancipation and Western theory of emancipation from 60s up to 90s. Nevertheless, we can trace more and more interest to this legacy as long as the expected emancipatory philosophic theories are quite often in crisis nowadays, are superseded by post-philosophies, are superseded by certain natural science mutations which are traded into humanities, and you all know very well to what extent it is fashionable now. So this idea of certain project of the universal emancipation is very interesting to refer back to. And I will just start and proceed. So the title of our meeting today and my talk today is Whether Ideal Can Be Material. And we all know to what extent it was criticized since 60s and that it was defied, that it was discarded and dismissed in philosophy and never referred back except for post-psychoanalysis, just to use it as certain repository of ideology and also some kind of field of critique, and I will try to account for it. So when we talk about ideal, we start with some kind of initial preliminary truth that already exists as some kind of detached metaphysics. This truth is not tangible, but what is tangible in our reality is not truthful. So this is the main ontological gap, that what is inaccessible is truthful, but it is ideal, and hence it's metaphysical, but what is tangible is profane. And philosophy had in the long run, been trying to solve this question between the ideal and the sensuous, the cognitive, the objective, mind and body. So this duplicity and this dualism, which actually could never been surpassed. There were serious efforts to get over it, not by means of converging them or mutating them or identifying them, but by means of getting rid of one of the components. And we know that starting from Nietzsche, the tendency was to get rid of the ideal in favor of life, of materiality, etc. And in post-structuralism, this process ended by a situation when thought doesn't need anymore the ideal and the idea. Thought itself is a semiological process which is material, which is generating, which is creating, which is a semiotic procedure, which can even become an idea, but in a contingent and performative way. So it is engendering process and has its own structural topology. So it can exert what thinking should exert without referring to any external or metaphysical outward ideologies or outward preliminary truths. And this attitude was post-ontological, performative, anti-dialectical, and we know this from post-structuralist bulk of classics, Derrida, Guattari, gender studies, and this process. In this process, the most important thing was that the signifier and the signified stopped to be the double process. So the serial construction, the capacity of proposition and of form to organize itself in series got rid of the problem to make this distinction or division between the signified and the signifier. And already in Derrida you have this equation that signs and things are quite contingently aggregated. So that the sublime, the issues of the sublime, are not necessary for thought or for any creative production. Another moment, another attitude, or another tendency took place in post-psychoanalysis, in post-Lacanian psychoanalysis, represented by, as you well know, Žižek and Mladen-Doller. They brought back the capacity of the idea to trace what happens in reality, but in their case, what was most important in claiming the ideality and in claiming the sublimity was that this sublimity and this ideal has crack in it. So the idea was that don't think that what has crack is not ideology. Don't think that what is deconstruction is devoid of ideology and of the ideal. And conversely, don't think that there is any ideality or any ideal or any ideology that is not permeated by perversities. And in this way, they completely somehow covered both the terrain of the ideal and the terrain of the reality by processes of the unconscious. By the work and labor of the unconscious. And then the subject, the sublime, the ideal is barred and cracked, whereas the reality and the immanences of the reality, the objective world, is simply the imaginary. So it's simply the repository to organize the illusions of the subject, which is cracked. So we see that to what extent it was subversive, this condition to bring back the ideal and ideology. But what happens in this socialist philosophy, and when we have a look at it, to what extent it is persistent on this Marxist idea that if we turn Hegel upside down, then we definitely can prove that the ideal will be not there on the heaven, the ideal will not be somewhere else as sublimity, but exactly the objective reality, which is constructed by human labor, will, in case it can attain certain common good as its regulative idea, can exert ideal materially. So there were quite a number of thinkers who were successors and followers of Marx in this way to somehow finish the work of Hegel in this objectification or materialization or Marxization of the possibility of the ideal within the worldly and within the existing reality. One of such personalities was Ewald Ilyenkov. I think his name is quite well known already. Not only in Russia, but at many conferences, there are people who research his work. And he was Marxist philosopher per se. You probably know the name of Mikhail Lifshitz. His work has just been translated. He was aesthetician, and he was also claiming the issue of the ideality of the real in his aesthetic works. And of course, Soviet psychologists, Alexei Leontiev and his professor and teacher, Lev Vygotsky, who worked earlier, but nevertheless they also have this stable standpoint that it is not the ideal that is generating the attitude to the real. It is not certain ideal, transcendental, subjective consciousness, as it is in Kant, that is perceiving this reality. Because there is no consciousness and no subjectivity as such per se without the objective process. But the initial thing is the material production, is the material reality, and only due to development and evolution and diachronics of the objective reality biased by labor, one can only produce any consciousness or any subject or any perception whatsoever. So in this conjecture, we see why Kant was somehow dismissed, because Kant relies on the transcendental inherent forms of psychics, and Hegel was taken as a very important figure because he was the first to claim that thought and consciousness cannot develop without objective reality and external objective reality. And if for Hegel this dependence of the subject and of the absolute on the objective reality was called reification or objectification, and this reification was a negative process. This was the process of alienation. For Marx, on the contrary, when we say that Marx turned Hegel upside down, this objectification was an affirmative process, which confirmed that actually there is no individual consciousness, there is no individual will, but they are constructed by activity, labor, history, and its purposefulness. But what nevertheless was disputed in Hegel by Ilyenkov and in this he's definitely following Marx, was that in Hegel's system, as we know, human life is effectuation of thought. So thought is primary, and conditioning by life is secondary. Life becomes the complement to the notion. Whereas Ilyenkov is insisting that it should be the other way around. Being should define the consciousness, and this is the classics that we know from Marx. So the ideal, the general, should be the subsequent stage, so should be the extension, should be the dialectical development of any material concreteness, because what life starts with is materiality. But it is not that in this materiality we have no ideality and we have to construct some kind of big cake to then claim something ideal. And these ideal constructions will be language. We all know that in post-structuralism, in structuralism, in psychoanalysis, the embodiment of the ideal construction was mathematics, language, and all the symbolic significations that we know from semiology. But it was the other way around. Language in this situation was just one of the means of dealing with the objective and the general, because in this standpoint and in this attitude, the ideal was not located in some kind of elevations of the real or elevations of the material. No, it was already existing in the labor process and in the diversity and in the objectivity of the real as a certain kind of activity which transforms natural forms into produced forms. So we all know this notion. It's really, or I should sit probably this way. We know this notion from Marx, verwandelt forms, transformed forms, or the notion of inorganic nature. Inorganic nature is everything that is produced as the result of invention of tools by means of human beings, and labor emerges due to invention of these tools of labor and then producing these transformed forms of being. So exactly this capacity to transform one material dimension into another material dimension and to keep them in constant bond, one can claim that already in the real practice, in the practice of labor, in the practice of not only language and speech, but already in the practice of the hand and of the inventive process of any object, you are inscribing the operation of thought. So this idea that thought is only autonomized in logical procedures and in logical semiology, in logic and in language, was defied by all these people whom I named, by Vygotsky, by Ilyenkov, by Leontiev, and they claimed that capacity for thought is already immanent in the movement of a hand, which tries to transform certain conditions in the reality. And language is simply one of the means to exert this transformation. And I will quote here Alexei Leontiev. He says, he argues, Thus, meanings interpret the world in the consciousness of men. Although language appears to be carrier of meaning, yet language is not its demiurge. Behind linguistic meanings hide socially developed methods of action, operations, in the process of which people change and perceive objective reality. In other words, meanings represent an ideal form of the existence of the objective world, its properties, connections, and relationships, disclosed by cooperative social practice, transformed and hidden in the material of language. Which means that language is not detached, it is not separate from this labor process, because the possibility and the capacity of the idea of thinking and of the ideal in its possibility to transform material into immaterial and back and generalize consciousness, it already exists in the procedures of labor. And then you will have a very different treatment of what ideal is, as against, for instance, classical Enlightenment, for which ideal was biased by Bildung, right? Education, enlightenment. And here, ideal, the possibility of the ideal and of the universal is biased by a labor process. And similarly and likewise, for all those thinkers, by the same token, labor and culture, as well as thinking and philosophy, did not differ at all. And this was quite a fantastic case when the material and immaterial production, or material and immaterial activity, was dialectically intertwined. And I would remind here the one of the motto of Lev Vygotsky, because, for instance, from surrealism, from psychoanalysis, from automatic writing in poetry, even from structuralist experimentations with linguistics, we remember that first comes some kind of tossing of words and some kind of irrational casting of words, and then we are able to refer to them back and reconstruct and reflect on them. So this constructed the psychoanalysis, and generally, if you look at theories of poetry, in many cases, this will be the definition or description of this process. Whereas Vygotsky claims that word appears only when there is thought. And thought is constructed by diachronics of multi-human, social, rich labor process. And without this labor process, no word would ever appear. Although if you think about first poet, you can imagine that he could, as a Dadaist, produce some kind of whatever. And this didn't have to be any constructed notions which would be the outcome of certain labor process. So these are two attitudes, but they were not claiming it. They had numerous experiments to prove especially how thinking is emerging among little children who are talking, but then they are using words, understanding why words are notions. We came to this statement that labor already on the level of its being, of its producing the tools, is already thought, and hence it is ideal, and it is in a way instrumental practice, but this instrumental and collective practice is already the practice of the ideal, which is able to get over this distinction between res extensa, the Cartesian distinction between res extensa, external world, and the processes of consciousness as some kind of internalization and internal sublime thinking process. On the level of on the level of activity, this possibility to de-autonomize meaning production from labor production and converge practice and thinking activity and logical constructions was possible. But what is the outcome of this? And I will return to this. Of course, they were relying probably and very strongly on the idea of Marx, of how to turn philosophy into praxis. And traditional interpretation of this, and probably I will be returning to this after every set of statement, the traditional interpretation of this is that, oh, very good, Marx got rid of philosophy, he returned everything to social practice, and therefore Marx was the person who also dispensed with the ideal. So let's deal with Marx as if he were also part of our team who just defied the ideal and confined himself solely with the immanent practices. And of course, the way Marx was used probably by Althusser and these circles would definitely fit this, and probably it is also very justified. Nevertheless, if we look what happens in the socialist construction and the way the speculative conditions are transformed into labor conditions, or what happens with the sublime, speculative, ideal, or universalist conditions after revolution, when the elevated and the profane come on the same level, is that, on the contrary, the fact that philosophy went into practice permeated praxis with philosophy. So it was that daily life became philosophy, and philosophy became daily life. And it wasn't that daily life got rid of philosophy for the sake of certain dephilosophised or desublimatized immanences or some kind of pure empiricist contingencies. On the contrary, praxis became nominalized. So meta and nomen came together. And this was actually begriff and thing. This was actually the certain dream, an unaccomplishable project of the phenomenology of spirit, how to bring absolute to this, how to bring thing to its notion and notion to its thing. And usually it was claimed as the failure of objective idealism, right? So let's shift a little bit and come to the way Ilyenkov deals with the issue of labor in dialectical logic. Because we all know that except for Hegel, his alter ego or another thinker who was extremely important for him was Spinoza. And of course, why they were so important for him? Because they were both philosophers of, in a way, one was dialectical monism and another was non-dialectical monism. The possibility to bring things to unification, to get rid of this duality between the extended res extensa and thought. And strangely, nevertheless, in his dialectical logic, he makes this allegation. So, he has already claimed that labor was important to create and to be thinking procedure. And this condition proves even the Spinozian motto and Spinozian premise, according to which thought and matter are extensions of substance. So both thought and matter are one, and thought even can be the extension of the substantial and material constructs. And we all know that this happens in Spinoza non-dialectically, and it's a big issue. I will not just go deeply into this, but what is important for Ilyenkov, that he says, yes, I understand that nature is substance, and substance makes it possible to produce thought as extension in Spinoza, and then this would prove that thought and matter would be one. But I would like to remind you about Marx. As Marx said, and this is already a dialectical virus which he couldn't get rid of, Marx says that only on the level of such nature which achieved the level of labor, and labor is of course the stage of nature, and appearance of man who is laboring and producing culture is nothing but nature, but only on this dialectical cyclic moment, and only on this moment, on this stage, it is possible to produce sociality and produce thinking. So he trying to be a Spinozist as well, he is an claiming this irreversibility of a dialectical procedure of a Marxian kind, which brings Marxian condition of labor as an irreversible moment and irreversible cornerstone before which thought and thinking and hence the ideal would be impossible. And I will quote very shortly, "It is precisely the alteration of nature by man, not solely nature as such, which is the most essential and immediate basis of human thought, and it is the measure that man has earned to change nature that his intelligence has increased. The subject of thought here already proved to be the individual in the nexus of social relations, the socially determined individual, all the forms of whose life activity were given not by nature but by history, by the process of the molding of human culture by activity." Next, and the most probably and very important premise to claim the general and the ideal is again something that Ilyenkov takes from Hegel and then operates with it in a different way, again overturning these conditions. You all remember the Hegel's concept, the other determined non-self. In Russian we say «несобственное бытие», and in German it's «Andersein». And Andersein epitomizes the dialectical process because dialectical process is always othering. It is othering, and that's why the spirit is always alienated and trying to sublate this othering and develop further. There is a Latin term for this, which is quid pro quo. So one by means of the other. So not the self, but the other self. This is, for Hegel, it's a classical case when spirit is alienated in object, in thinkhood. But what Ilyenkov, following again Marx, did, he claims that, well, this plunging of the spirit into thinkhood, it's not alienation. This capacity to be other and this capacity to be all the time othering is the nature of the objective world. It's the nature of the objective world because objective world is transformative and it's constantly in history. It's constantly in historical dialectical process, and it's constantly in labor process. It's constantly in activity process. That's why there's not a single thing that could be self. This position is radically, this was probably his critique of positivism. He was a very fierce critique of nominalism and positivist philosophy, and partly of phenomenology, because in phenomenology is not nominalism, of course, but it is biased by perception of the phenomenon, by the object. So consciousness and object are connected by means of perception, not by means of activity. This constant and radical and absolutely overall condition of the Andersein, where everything is other to itself and everything is the other self and other determined non-self, was extremely important also to claim the general, the allgemeine. So that it's not that hermetic and autonomous individuals that are constructed certain collectivity, but these are collectivities which are always in dialectical process of non-selfing. And one of the classical examples, which I probably use very often, even with my students, is Ilyenkov's example about the jar. You see the jar, but it is constructed by the clay, it is constructed by the labor, it is constructed by the value form, by certain consequence of traditions of making this jar. So you can never say that diachronics that in a way surrounds this object could ever stop, because it's always diachronical. The same is this pen. The same is the spoon. So whatever we take, this real object is realization of labor process, of activities which are material and non-material, although this is a material thing. On the other hand, non-material things like piece of music or a piece of philosophy can be claimed as labor processes as well in terms of procedure of consciousness, etc. And one of the classical forms of this non-self, which is at the same time general and at the same time ideal, is the form of value form. Classically, it is determined and defined as abstraction, right? So it's a certain abstract form. But the idea of Marxist socialist philosophy was to claim that there is no pure autonomous abstraction and there is no pure autonomous nominal positivist materiality, as for instance today in object-oriented ontologies. So the abstract and concrete procedures, materialities and immaterialities, are irreversibly and dialectically mutated and interconnected. But moreover, they are simultaneous and they are not discrete. And it is very important to claim that things are not discrete and human relations are not discrete. So this indiscreteness is something that is counter post-structuralist and counter semiotic and counter semiological, where discreteness in this contingent series is most important thing. The sign is what is the sign, and the series what is this series. So certain literalness of certain literalness of the semiology, which was completely converse tradition. So returning to the value form is a representation of a commodity, of the labor needed for its production, of time and costs, as well of the relations of production and the means of productions involved in making this commodity. In other words, it is an abstract sign, it is symbolic, operating and referring to many aspects of life and production, nonetheless, and constructing thus the non-self being of the objecthood of the product. So the value is not a product, but it's a non-self being of the product that comprises numerous objective social conditions around it. Thus, value form plays the role of an immaterial sign, revealing the materiality of production and that of social relations. The value form is ideal, but at the same time, it is the mirror, an absolute mirror of material procedures, acts, beings reflected by this form. Thus, this logic again confirms that abstraction is not autonomous, and the outwardness of being is not some kind of profane reality, but it already contains the capacity for the ideal and the general, because everything that exists is all the time non-self, and by means of being non-self, it has this capacity to universalize and generalize. Now the most, a little bit tricky part, which I don't know whether I go through this or not, but maybe in a very short way, because this is distinction between Hegelian obsession of Ilyenkov and his Marxian, Hegelian Marxian obsession and Spinozist obsession, and why this didn't work, because there are lots of thinkers nowadays who compare Hegel and Spinoza, and there's a famous book by Pierre Macheret, Hegel or Spinoza. There are other books which were written much later also by our comrades and friends, like Gregor Moder, for instance, Hegel and Spinoza, which try to, if you are on the position of a Hegel, then you try to dialecticize Spinoza. If you are on the standpoint of Spinoza, then you try to show to what extent Hegel is contingent and absolutely full of this immanences, etc. So that Hegel is not skipping up to subject, but remaining on the level of substance, like Spinoza, etc. And this is a long debate, and the main thing is not the goal of this comparison, but the main thing is to prove that the post-Spinozist thought, which was most contemporary thought, actually, in the history of the Western European philosophy coming after Althusser, because, well, almost everyone was the disciple of Althusser. To what extent this could be correlated by what what was exemplary for these Marxist, a little bit idiots, Soviet idiots. I call them idiots because they are so obsessed by virtue and they are constantly claiming that virtue exists. So in this thought, you don't have this presence of evil and negativity that you confront in Western thought of emancipation, because Western thought of emancipation in 60s is biased by, constructed by impossibility of social virtue. So coming to Spinoza, what was so important in Spinoza? What was important in Hegel, I already said. It is a possibility of the ideal within objective world, and quid pro quo, this Andersein, the possibility of the generalization in the materiality of the Andersein. Why was Spinoza important? Because Spinoza had this incredible idea that there is affectation of thought by the matter, that thought that is not an internal psychic process, but it can be formed due to external being. And Ilyenkov was all the time quoting this statement about Spinoza that why it is incredibly conceptual for him is that thought is exerted for Spinoza in the relatedness of a thinking body with other objects external to it and affected by their shapes and contours. So this possibility that external world affects thought, and the thought can be affectation itself from the externality. And this was the proof for Ilyenkov that thought is an external process. So what was his obsession all the time? That thought is not an intrinsic solipsist process of a transcendental subject. Thought is not a certain internal process of brain, and now the brain scholars would, of course, dispute it, but that thought is completely externalized and conditioned by the material externality. And Spinozism was for him one of these great example that substance guarantees this interaction between thinking body and external world. But my allegation is, and maybe you will not agree with me, there are certain thinkers also who dealt with Spinozism of Vygotsky and dealt with Spinozism of Ilyenkov, who claim that what Ilyenkov wanted from the convergence, from this crazy idea of making one snowball from meta and idea, Spinoza was never doing. So actually this total intermingling and commingling of the thinking procedures of attribute of thought and attribute of meta never happened in Spinoza, simply because for him these were parallel values, and they were related by correspondence, equivalence, by order, and they were so self-contained in their own orders that their commingling was not conceptually necessary. And actually, even Pierre Macheret is confirming this. Maybe I wouldn't read necessarily the quotations, but again, what I want to say that in post-Spinozist thoughts, for instance, in post-structuralism, something from which I started, the main thing is performative commingling. When I was when I was giving the lecture at one of the art centers once and claiming this necessity of unification of meta and idea, somebody told me, and why do you need to converge them at all? You can do it performatively. You can do it semiologically. You can do it as in American pragmatism, even like in Charles Sanders Peirce, when you have just thinking procedures as some pragmatic acts in sequence. So you can do these things in the order of sequences, and even if they don't have reciprocity or some kind of, I don't know, chemical convergence, nothing bad happens. They can be contingently correlated in their equivalences. And another thing that Deleuze is all the time claiming about Spinozism is that what is important in these equivalences and in this impossibility to converge attribute as thought and attribute as they are equal, they are parallel, but just because they have their own parallel orders, they don't need any chemical convergence, as in this, augmenting, cycling procedure of a Hegelian type. So they don't need the critical mass of labor. A Spinozist would say, you don't need this stage of labor to construct the possibility of thought in nature. And the Marxist and dialectician says, no, I need this irreversible moment of labor to claim the possibility of the human society. What is important and beautiful in Spinozism is this immanence of locatable and topology. This is something that was extremely developed by post-structuralism, topologization. And immanentization and literalness of science and of semiology. Which is not teleological, which is not expedient, but which is sporadic and contingent. Whereas for Ilienkov, mind and meta need to converge on the level of not even ontology, but as I said last time, and Mina told me it's too incomprehensible, ontically. So what is ontical and ontological? Ontology is so it's very important. It's very important that idea and sublime becomes ontic, not only ontological, because ontology is already when we impose meanings and we impose on this empirical reality certain semantic constructions which make being ontologized, which is expressed in language, expressed in statements, in meanings. And ontics is this very profane condition. And imagine that exactly on this very profane condition, things acquire certain completely different aureole. So what can happen ontically? That commodity is not commodity, or the fact that thing is ugly is not noticeable anyway, or what can happen ontically? The difference between the expensive and cheap disappears. The difference between shabby and refined disappears. So what is this view or perspective which changes the ontics when political economy is changed? So can and this is the question that comes already from the economic philosophic manuscripts of Marx of 1844, and becoming obsession for Ilyenkov as well, exactly the reason why he all the time wants to claim that we don't need to go to some Platonic universe. We don't have to organize some utopian state. Our utopian state is here, which is virtuous, which is truthful, and which has the common good. Because communism has already been established, right? So all the things have to bear, materially bear, this quality of some kind of general value, not simply be certain perceived objects or commodities or the objects of that are liked or not liked, but be certain epiphenomena. As I said in the beginning, be certain noumena. And again, I return to this Marxian point when, if you agree the way I interpret it, but maybe you can argue with me, that philosophy becoming practice means that practical and material is completely and irreversibly philosophized. And it is philosophized because what was alienating the ideal from the material disappeared. And what is the main condition that alienates ideal from the material? From the Marxian point of view, not from Hegelian point of view. Even from Hegelian point of view, if we read the dialectics of the master and slave, what alienates one from the other is labor and the products of labor. And what alienates material from the ideal is, even in Marx as well, is division of labor. Is division of labor into thinking and into hands. But if the obsession is that thinking is already in hand-making and labor process is containing thinking, so what should be the condition of the society which would prove that if the division of labor is evicted, then the private property is evicted, surplus value, which produces this desire, libidinal hunger, and phantasmatic constructions of the objecthood is evicted, what remains? Don't we have this exactly nominal character when a thing is what it makes? Anton von Webern, an Austrian composer, had such notion, Fasslichkeit, which meant that the goal of the object is what it makes. And the invention of the objects is this minimal but absolutely full-fledged and absolutely pleromatic condition, pleromatic in terms of plenitude. So the fact that the pen writes and the pen is invented to write is already pleroma. It's completely full of plenitude. And the fact that it can be not plastic but golden and produced by some brand and then having some kind of, I don't know, surplus Oreos because it was owned by someone, etc., etc. So some symbolizations, they are additive and complementary. So there is some kind of basic general construction of things, even on the ontic level, which makes it possible to nominalize matter, but at the same time materialize the nomen. This is probably the reason why such an abnormal idea about converging the meta and the ideal and materialize ideal and see idealities within practical procedures is definitely conditioned by post-revolutionary political economy, which badly or well evicts surplus value. Of course, it had shadow economy. Of course, it had definitely state monopoly for distribution and distributive economy, but nevertheless, there is this condition that certain constructs of labor division and alienation are somehow discarded. So here is this allegation which I made in the end, that private property and division of labor as something that epitomizes alienation and makes alienation an ontological problem, right? Because my friends probably, when I write about or quote such term as de-alienating or non-alienating, they immediately get into panic and think that it's some kind of redemption, and how can you de-alienate when alienation is part and parcel of birth and death is already alienation. So it's an ontological fate of human being to be alienated already by the token of being mortal. Nevertheless, if we go through the writing again, for instance, of either Alexei Leontiev or Vygotsky or Orlienkov, you all the time come across this condition that we don't need to solve the problems of alienation on the level of ideology. Just go to on the level of high-flown language or whatever. Just go to political economy. Just do something in political economy, and then these alienating extensions, not all of them, but they will be discarded. And I will read here one of the quotations from, I think, Ilyenkov, where he writes about political economy and language and alienation. It's in Russian, but I will try to comprise it. He was arguing with Heidegger, and Heidegger's idea that a language is the home of being, and being is in language. And for him, this was crazy idea, because being is in labor. And he says that to sublate alienation, we don't need to go to plunge into the language and understand what happens in the language, but we have to return to the productive activity of human beings, and the act of sublating alienation will be seen by us in the production of things, in the production of the tools of production, and then we shall search for these means of sublating alienation in political economy and not in linguistics, not in syntaxes, not in semantics, which contain in themselves this mystical idea to what extent language is alienated. Mina, how much time do I have? Yeah, maybe I wrap up in a couple of minutes. Okay, so I just wrap up with the last paragraph. So the nominalization of objecthood in the socialist and Soviet everyday manifests the expediency, teleology of the material ideal as the regime inevitable in communist economy, but on the other hand, it shows that in historical socialism, the role of the ideal revealed itself as a paradoxical construct. Something that is far from the ideal from the point of view of techne is nevertheless completely ideal socially, ethically, existentially, and ontically. Yet this is not because socialist masses or people or collectives accept such nominal dimension of material life being brainwashed by communist ideology, but because the principal merit of a material thing in deprivatized economy becomes its eidetic, generalized, generic basic function. And hence it is this eidetic nominal basis, for example, the fact that scissors cut or that bread feeds, the plates are used for food, that constructs both the material telos of objecthood as well as its conceptual expediency. This view considers objects of use, things of material world, as epiphenomena rather than objects of consumption and commodities. Such function of material object is the consequence of the production biased by use value. Thanks. Well, in a way, this would be two attitudes to ideology, I would say. Because one, Žižekian attitude to ideology claims ideology as a negative merit, right, of any society, and then it searches for ideology in nice deconstructive non-ideologies, which are also blamed in being ideological, or in liberal democracy, which is against ideology, but which is even more ideological. And here, the collectivity that we mean, I could not talk about it, but it has a very strange temporal paradox that it already achieves something before it has the possibility and capacity to achieve, because it has any technical or productive forces to achieve certain things. That's why the idea in socialist construction becomes this situation when you are always out of idea. Do you understand me? So when you have communism already, you are always worse than communism. So instead of subvert ideology, you all the time have to be this idea because you are all the time kicked out of the idea. And so this is rather the symptom and syndrome of communist society, that you are away from ideology. That's why you, yes. Yeah. And whereas here you somehow, you are, well, this is Foucaultian idea, Althusserian idea, apparati, everywhere is apparati, and we have to subvert it. And in socialist condition, you need more idea. It's always the lack of it, because we cannot construct it as it has been constructed in its infrastructural model. Yeah. I don't imagine post-labor society. There will be some labor. They would always would be not labor of producing products maybe, but the labor would always be invented in terms of some kind of excessive, perverse, or any other services. You cannot evade labor. I think labor would exist, especially if the society is not equal, and then you would invent certain specific types of labor. Then I wouldn't say that there would ever be post-labor societies. It was probably some utopian dream of post-operaism, because well, if you take this affirmative idea of labor, and Marx has this, and this was totally criticized in post-Marxian thought because labor is abstracted labor and it is subsumed labor, etc. So it was understood as extreme case of subsumption, right? Well, if you translate labor in what these guys say, activity, and activity is not only pragmatic or utilitarian production, but the production for the other in a general sense. So it is inventive, so it is cognitive and in a way gnoseology. So labor is gnoseological, and this is a very important thing. That art is gnoseological, labor is gnoseological, and even revolution is gnoseological. So it brings us to new gnoseology at all, per se. May I start with one example which Ilyenkov uses as what is general? He says that usually we have this medieval or Aristotelian idea of the general, invariant of something, or many things generalized by means of some merit or some quality or some quantity. Either mathematically or in terms of certain qualitative similitude or affinity. And he makes this, this is something that I never, ever came across. He says that table and chair are more general than table and table. And, well, one human and another human are more general, so people become general because they lack something. Because they lack the other, and the other is the non-self. So, just due to having this lack of the self, you need the othering and the other self. So, this is all the time this possibility of generalization by means of not insisting on the autonomy of the self. And I think that. Well, Hegel already has this in his dialectics. I mean, whatever dialectical cycle he describes, starting from master-slave to any other, it is all the time this absolutely dizzy situation when whatever you thought that is already pacified as identity is never pacified as any identity. So I think this is the capacity to de-identify, and later Mikhail Lifshitz, another philosopher and aesthetician, even had a very strange and crazy idea of resignation. He called it human resignation. He takes this from aesthetics of Vasily Belinsky, and he uses the capacity to resign from the self as the true artistic achievement. So, and then this necessity to resign from the self becomes some kind of ethics of the common. But then it gets internalized, because Vygotsky and Leontief were saying that this resignation then internalizes into the self and constructs personality. And without this resignation, the person which is for the commons is not constructed. So again, this is a dialectical process of externalization and then internalization of your own lacking of the self. I think that, well, to start with very, very simplistic attitude and very utilitarian interest, I think that many liberating theories, or many theories which seemed to be extremely revolutionary and which epitomize revolutionary and actionist movements in philosophy and in cultural politics, they are either obsolete or in contemporary politics they proved to be absolutely unproductive. And transformed themselves into some kind of absolutely autonomous, hermetic, self-contained cultural space of, I don't know, left theory, the so-called left critical theory, which doesn't have extension or any continuity with the broader social sphere, I would say. So here we, on the contrary, have the situation when the social sphere is already claimed as achieved and organized in certain way, and then intellectual or cultural tradition has to fit it. Not that art, like in our case, has to achieve emancipation. No, the revolution achieved emancipation, so the artists have to just catch up with it. And why this legacy is so important? Because it brings us some kind of alternative project of enlightenment. Okay. Because the critique of enlightenment took place, and last time I tried to talk about it, on the rupture when the modernism starts, when you don't know whether it is critique of enlightenment as counter-enlightenment, or whether counter-enlightenment should become new enlightenment, or as if counter-enlightenment should become some kind of sacrilege of the enlightenment. So these things were mutated in the 20th century and the 21st century. And if you look even at contemporary thought, even at the thought of speculative realism, when extremely reactionary and non-progressive things are claimed as emancipatory, and you never know how. So there is such a ambivalence and ambiguity of what emancipation is, exactly because of this place and this relativity and this extrapolation of what subversivities and micro-revolutionary models of acting and thinking meant. But this legacy is not Russian legacy at all, and this is not a socialist legacy. So many friends would tell me, come on, this is local informant, this is something exotic. No, I wouldn't say this. I think that this somehow retranslates or returns us to certain rift or rupture that happened in the history of European thought, like on the verge of the centuries, and maybe it's not so bad to look at it.